Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our first guest is Cecilia Enjuto Rangel, an assistant professor in the Department of Romance Languages. She earned her BA at the Universidad de Puerto Rico and her MA and her PhD at a university called Yale. She came to the University of Oregon in 2005. Her academic interests include 19th and 20th century Spanish and Latin American poetry and transatlantic studies. She is currently working on 2 book projects, Cities in Ruins in Modern Poetry, and an edition of The Truth About the Case of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, a judge's account by Federico Enjuto Ferran. Just great to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Tell me what transatlantic studies are exactly. I know that your chair, Barbara Altman, was talking about how important you were to the future of transatlantic studies in the Department of Romance Languages. Give us an idea of what it is.
Well, I think transatlantic studies is becoming more and more important for both Romance languages, Spanish departments, and comparative literature departments because it builds bridges between Latin American and Spanish literatures without having to constrain ourselves to national borders and nationalist literatures. So that's mainly one of the things why I think more and more scholars are more interested in transatlantic perspectives and comparisons between Spain and Latin America. For example, The Dictatorship, the novel of the dictator is one of them, and the Poetry of the War is another. And there's common ground.
You mean The Dictator in Spain and
in Latin America? There's so many dictators, and so
I wonder why. Maybe we don't have time to speculate on that today. So transatlantic studies. So you sort of work then both in Spanish literature and then also in Latin American literature as well.
Exactly.
And in the old days, that wasn't the case.
No, in the old days, it was very divided and divisive, and that created, I think that it creates more problems than solutions in many ways. And I think it's wonderful to be able to explore and be familiar with both literary traditions because they're in dialogue.
Right.
You know, if you study the poets I study, like Neruda and Alberti and Lorca, they were all really good friends, you know? They were in constant dialogue.
Right.
So it wasn't for them as divisive in that sense.
So I guess also to have Latin America here and Spain here is to sort of reproduce the whole colonialist attitude, isn't it?
Exactly.
And then the people in Latin America are sort of second-class citizens in a certain way to the great canon.
It wasn't like that in the beginning, I think, in Hispanic studies in the U.S.
It wasn't.
It was.
I see.
But more and more Latin American studies became very important and gained a lot of ground in U.S. academic circles. So.
Cities in Ruins in Modern Poetry, and you have a Humanities Center a research fellowship. We were just speaking of this before the show in next spring that you're going to be working on. Tell us what Cities in Ruins in Modern Poetry is about.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate to have had that fellowship because I'll be able to finish. And it started with my dissertation, and it's mainly my revision of the topos of ruins in modern poetry. The
topos of ruins. So for our non-literary audience, what's a topos?
Well, it's poems that talk about ruins.
I see.
A lot of poems have been and the representation of ruins have been studied a lot in Baroque and Romantic poetry, but not so much in modern poetry. And so what I mainly do is I study poets, modern poets that think about modern ruins and what it tells them about the modern past and the ancient past also, historical and literary. And so that's in a nutshell what I'm thinking.
So you would think of the idea of a ruin as something way back, but what you're saying is that modernity had its own conception of what ruins are, and they may not have been old, but they were pretty powerful.
Exactly, very overwhelming, and it usually creates a traumatic response. And in my argument is that it creates also a historical awakening. It makes them think. It makes these poets think about why those ruins exist and what are their products of. And they're usually products of war or progress. And so these poems on ruins in modern poetry usually carry critique to modern progress and modernity itself. So that's mainly what I'm working on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds fascinating. Of course, it is fascinating because you got a Humanities Center grant in a very competitive process. So,
Thanks.
I think you've mentioned that you feel it's difficult to publish or get things published on poetry per se. Do you think that's true? Is that true in your field?
Well, at first, a lot of people told me, why do you want to work on poetry? You will never be able to, one, find who to work with, two, publish your book. It's very hard to publish in poetry. I hope that it doesn't happen like that. I hope that I'll have luck and that I'll be able to find a publisher. But I'm more excited about poetry at the UFO that I've ever been anywhere else.
At the University of Oregon.
Yeah, the University of Oregon.
Tell me about that.
Because I find more people interested in poetry, and both professors, both colleagues and students. They're so excited about poetry. So I get very mad at people when they say that it's outdated or that people are not interested in it anymore. I actually spoke with an editor the other day who came and I told her about the project, and she was like, well, I guess it's a little bit too late for you to change genres.
Really? To change genres?
For you to like go into narrative instead.
Oh my goodness.
I'm like, yes, it is, and it is, and I did decide to work on poetry on purpose.
Well, you'll show them, I'm sure. We'll show them. I work on poetry too.
Yeah.
We'll keep it going.
It's very vibrant here. Actually, we did poetry reading the other day. I organized a talk by Clayton Eshelman, the translator of the complete works of Cesar Vallejo, the Peruvian poet. And I was surprised. It was so full. There were like 75 people, students and professors and graduate students, undergrad, and they all enjoyed it so much. And it was both in Spanish and in English, so it was bilingual. I was very, very happy with that.
Well, I have a feeling you're gonna luck out. So now a really interesting project is the edition you're working on with your husband. You want to tell us about that? And in fact, the author was your grandfather of this. Fascinating. Give us some sense of what this is about.
Well, I think actually it connects with my interest in transatlantic studies. I am a hybrid Puerto Rican. I'm a weird Puerto Rican because I come from two political exiles. My father was an exile from the Spanish Civil War, and my mother was an exile from the Cuban Revolution. And they met. They were both professors, and they met in Puerto Rico. And that's how I was born. And this tradition or this heritage of coming from exiles has really marked both my ways of reading and my interest in which book projects I'm choosing, obviously. And I had always known about this manuscript. It existed in my family. We always called them las memorias, the memory, which is, or the memoirs. But it's really a testimony more than a memoir. It's mainly focused on the role of my grandfather, who was an investigative judge, in the trial of this very, very important fascist leader called José Antonio Primo de Rivera.
So this was in, where was the trial?
The trial was in Spain in 1936, November 1936, right at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. And that's why it was a very, very, that's why it was crucial. It was such an important trial because the eyes of the world were looking at the Spanish justice and Republican justice to see if they were, worth helping. They were very much ignored, and so my grandfather is very conscious of this process and the importance of the trial itself, and he narrates his experiences, how he reads the progress or the process towards the Spanish Civil War, and how he also lived through the trial and the turmoils of that time. It was just, there were so many threats. And
to him.
Yeah.
So what did
it's
he?
very dangerous.
So now he was the judge.
Yeah, he was investigative judge.
So what was the ruling
Well,
in this case?
Well, he was. This is why it's such a controversial trial. He was guilty, found guilty, and he, was killed.
Guilty of?
Of being one of the instigators of the Spanish Civil War.
I see.
And my grandfather didn't he wasn't the judge. He was the investigative judge, which means that he gave all the evidence and looked for all the evidence and did all the interviews to say that this man there was enough information for him to be tried.
I see. And that's it, just to be tried.
Yeah, but he was blamed as for many, many years and from many different sectors of society. He was blamed.
Your grandfather was blamed for this.
For the outcome of the trial.
Right. So what is somebody ethically to do in that circumstance? I mean, who is in power in 36?
Well, the problem is that it was in the middle of the war.
In the middle of the war, so
there was he was a judge who was loyal to the Republic, who was a democratic system.
I see.
And this was a fascist leader.
Right.
And obviously, in the beginning of the
this guy was a fascist who was sentenced.
Exactly. And my grandfather was a Republican.
So who blamed him then? The fascists, or who your grandfather?
Of course, the fascist historiography blamed my grandfather of his death.
But that's all now. The history is being rewritten.
Exactly, and yet there's a lot of turmoil in Spain nowadays, and history is being rewritten, but there's a lot of ignorance of what happened during the war.
See.
And it's a very divisive and divided country, and the war is a divisive topic.
Right.
And so this is a very controversial
I can see that.
Book.
Controversial and very difficult book. In the kind of minute and a half left, I mean, there's so many things to talk about, but so your father was in exile from the Spanish Civil War,
exactly,
and your mother from the Cuban Revolution. So I don't know, were they coming from different parts? No. So politically they were compatible.
Yeah, they were both leftists politically. My father even became secretary of the Socialist Party in Spain, and so they were both leftists, but they were not in favor of being told how to think. I guess they were professors. So.
Right. So, how much do you work on this controversial project? I mean,
I wish I could work on it more. My focus right now is Modern City in Ruins.
Got to get that done.
That's my
But the other one is sort of waiting in the wings for you.
Yeah, we laugh that it's our hobby. We do it on our spare time, which it's whenever we go to Spain or when we can give a talk about it. But it's an exciting project, and it really touches us both. My husband Pedro Garcia Caro and me. We're both very, very involved in it. So.
And I'm sure you've seen, and everybody knows now, Pan's Labyrinth, which is really about
I love Pan's Labyrinth.
It's a great film. Go see it.
Exactly. It's such a poetic film, isn't it?
Yes. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been great speaking with you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
And we've been speaking with Cecilia Enjuto Rangel, an assistant professor in the Department of Romance Languages. We'll be right back. Welcome back to UO Today. Our next guest is David Vazquez, an assistant professor in the Department of English. David Vazquez earned his BA at the University of South Florida and his MA and PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He came to the University of Oregon in 2003. His research interests include the Latino-Latina cultural nationalist movements of the 60s and 70s, the work of Puerto Rican intellectual Jesus Colon from the 30s to the 60s, and an examination of neocolonialist discourse to be found in contemporary surf travel narratives, and he'll explain to us what that's about. He's currently working on a book manuscript, Trialectics of the Self, Latino autobiography, community, and nation. And thank you so much. I know you have a very busy life, and we're very grateful to have you on the show, and to have you in the department. So, tell me, when you began studying as an undergraduate, when you first began, you probably didn't take any classes, or maybe you did in Latino, Latina
No,
literature.
actually, that was one of the things that there was a real difference between my undergraduate and my graduate curriculum. I had a break of about 8 years between the two, and during the 80s when I was an undergraduate, you're right, I never took a class where anything was taught by a Latino or Latina author. And if I think about it, the only Latino professor I had throughout the course of my undergraduate and graduate curriculum was Carl Gutierrez-Jones at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He was the first one that I'd had when I was in graduate school.
But as an undergraduate, then you didn't have.
I didn't have any. I had
Uh-huh.
none. Yeah,
Mhm,
yeah.
mhm.
So sort of an interesting change in those 8 years.
What about just in the curriculum itself, or an occasional author here and there?
None.
Not
as an undergraduate. None. Yeah.
So, so let's get to your own teaching. So when you came to the English department, obviously you brought things to it that weren't there before. Maybe you can give us an idea of what you've been teaching that hadn't been taught in the department before you came.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you well know, I was brought here to really broaden the curriculum in this direction, and a lot of what I do is sort of traditional literary analysis, but I focus on Latino and Latina authors, and I have a couple of courses that I do, English 245, English 363, et cetera. And what I try to do in these courses is to look at a comparative analysis of different Latino and Latina national groups in the United States. So all the work that I do is written originally in English by authors who live and who are usually citizens of the United States. But what I try to do is focus on how these authors are articulating a different version of the U.S. experience. And so oftentimes they're speaking from positions that are really different from those that are articulated by mainstream authors. So they're able to speak to ideas around racialization and the construction of ethnic identities and these types of things that you don't always get from mainstream U.S. authors. And, but what I try and do is to emphasize to my students that this is part of the American experience and not a departure from the U.S. experience. So I try and get them to think very critically about the fact that these issues are part and parcel of who we are as a people, rather than kind of departure from that idea, kind of walk into
some marginalized space,
yes,
as opposed to what America is,
yes,
or at least
yeah.
should be. Or
yes, yeah.
So, and you mentioned those numbers again and what those classes are, the titles of those classes.
English 245 is a kind of general rubric, an introduction to ethnic literature. The way that I teach it is as an intro to Latino and Latina studies. So what we do in the class is we look at a variety of texts from different national groups. So I'll do a unit on Chicano and Chicana authors, a unit on Puerto Rican authors, a unit on Dominican authors, et cetera. And I don't think about this as a kind of multicultural, pluralist approach, but rather as a kind of multi-ethnic rubric that's thinking about connections and differences between these various groups. As we know, the way that Latinos and Latinas have been defined in the United States has often been in terms of one larger group. So what I try and do is to get students to understand that this larger group is really comprised by people who are really radically different, and in some ways have less in common with each other than they do with people from mainstream areas of the United States. And so what I want them to think about is how is the function of this overall sort of umbrella category. And I'm also thinking about the potential for that kind of inter-ethnic unity. I worked with people in grad school who think a lot about inter-ethnic alliances, and so while I'm sort of critical of that idea of a kind of umbrella category, I also want to think about the possibilities for political alliances that might exist, and looking at literature as articulating certain spaces that might serve as potential rallying points for various ethnic groups.
So for people who are not familiar with some of the terminology, explain to people the difference between Chicano, Chicana, and Latino, Latina. What do those terms mean exactly?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question, and one often that my students are confused about. generally speaking, you know, these are highly contested terms, but generally speaking, Chicanos and Chicanas are people of Mexican or Mexican-American descent who live in the United States. The word Chicano has taken on a new meaning in the last 30 or 40 years. It was once used as a term of derision for people of Mexican-American descent or Mexican-American descent, but was sort of recolonized in the 1960s by the Chicano nationalist movement to signify a kind of political identity. And so, so I think that people who choose to self-identify as Chicano or Chicana today are often also self-electing to participate in a kind of progressive political position as well. The term Latino or Latina, on the other hand, is signifying this larger sort of identity category. So Latinos and Latinas can comprise Chicanos or Chicanas, but they might also comprise Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Venezuelans, people from parts of Central America, South America, parts of the Hispanophone Caribbean. You know, you name it. And,
right.
But unlike the term Hispanic, which is one that seems to be, that has been sort of designated by the state, Latino and Latina has also come to signify in certain ways a more progressive political identity. Now, of course, you know, as I said, these are highly contested terms, so there are a lot of regional differences as well. So, for example, if you go to the Northeast, where many of my relatives live, people talk about themselves as being Spanish, right? And that is a sort of umbrella category that might signify Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, perhaps some newer Chicano or Chicana migrants to New York City, these types of groups. As well in the Southwest, especially in New Mexico, people are very attached to the term Hispanic. So there are lots of differences, and I think the important thing to recognize is that these categories are sort of larger ethnic identifications, but there's a lot of specificity that's contained within those definitions. So I always try and emphasize with my students that we don't want to lose that specificity by using these larger umbrella terms.
Well, one more larger umbrella term before we're done. You mentioned that Chicano, and then you mentioned Latino being a larger. What about, where does Hispanic fit into that?
Well, Hispanic's an interesting category because Hispanic is not a category that Latinos and Latinas have come up with on their own. In fact, the word Hispanic actually has a history that dates back to the 1970 census, when the U.S. sought to sort of quantify various peoples who were starting to come to the United States from various parts of Latin America. Of course, the history of migration from Latin America to the United States has a longer history than 1970, but at some point around the late 1960s and early 1970s, the state became aware of, you know, from a kind of political standpoint of larger numbers of people, and therefore sought to sort of quantify where they were in their existence in the United States. There's a very interesting book by a woman named Suzanne Oboler, who sort of thinks about the power of ethnic labeling, and she really gives a lot of history to the term Hispanic. Yeah. So
it's not used very much then within your field. In other words, it's more of a.
I wouldn't actually say that. It's used oftentimes interchangeably with Latino and Latina.
I see.
But I think that it has a more. Well, I think that Latino and Latina has come to signify a more progressive political agenda.
I see what you mean. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So tell us about Colón.
Yeah.
And why he's been so understudied in particular.
Yeah. Jesus Colón, a very interesting Puerto Rican intellectual of the first half of the 20th century. He was a Puerto Rican national who came to the United States during World War I and came of age during the sort of early part of the 20th century and was raised around the tabaquero culture, the cigar-making culture in Puerto Rico, which I'm not sure if you're aware, but cigar making during this period had a long tradition of intellectual activity, and so while cigar workers would roll their cigars, they actually paid a reader who would read all sorts of interesting things, Balzac, Marx.
While they were doing the work?
Lenin, while they were doing the work, yes. And so oftentimes while cigar workers were technically illiterate, they were exposed to very complicated ideas.
So sometimes a cigar is not just a cigar.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And Colón, who was sort of raised up, he literally had a cigar making factory in his backyard as a child, became exposed to tabaquero culture and became politicized through this. So when he came to the United States, he was sort of bound by the conditions in the 20s and 30s, which relegated him to a life essentially of manual labor. But he became also a trade union organizer, a columnist for the Daily Worker, and was just a really interesting kind of figure who was very much involved in the Communist Party in New York City during the period of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I think part of the reason why he's been understudied is because he operates during a time when the Communist Party is on the downside, and so from about the 40s and 50s on, you know, with the Red Scares and all these sorts of things, the popularity of the party among people of color and among trade union activists, et cetera, starts to decline, and Colón clings to his affiliation with the party, which is sort of problematic in certain ways, especially with the rise of Stalin and all these sorts of things. But I think he's also an important figure because he bridges the period of the 1930s with the 1960s when we have a kind of resurgence of ethnic nationalism in the United States. And so Colón, in some ways, I think, mediates this in his work. He's primarily known for one book, which was called A Puerto Rican in New York and Other Sketches, which is largely a collection of his writings for the Daily Worker, although there are other things included in there. But what I find really interesting about him and his work is that he does a kind of organic cultural studies years before people are really thinking about this kind of work. He's not a great writer, but he is a really interesting thinker. And I think that his evolution from 1930s trade union activism to a kind of more militant stance in the 1960s is very much evocative of the changes that are going on in Puerto Rican communities in the United States during that period, and really Latino and Latina communities, because he's also a thinker who's thinking about connections between Latin American groups as well, at a time when nobody's really thinking about this work. So, yeah.
Well, we're actually out of time.
Great.
It went very quickly. We'd
Yes.
love to come back and talk to you again as your work progresses. It's been great to speak with you today.
Great. Well, the pleasure's been mine.
Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah.
And we've been speaking with David Vazquez of the English Department at the University of Oregon. Thanks for watching.